you higher, I will forever be intertwined with you. Where the sun never goes down and time has slowed down. Would it be too crazy if we decided to stay forever? Decided to stay forever, forever.
Look, kid. Bad things happen, and you can't do anything about it, right?
Right.
Wrong! When the world turns its back on you, you turn your back on the world.
Well, that's not what I was told.
Then maybe you need a new lesson. Repeat after me. Hakuna Matata.
What?
Hakuna Matata. It means no worries.
Repeat after me. Hakuna Matata.
Hakuna Matata. It means no worries.
Good morning, everybody. I am very pleased and proud to say a few words of welcome on behalf of Meetup in my capacity of director of Meetup as we begin the first Latin American workshop. As in previous version, we have attendees from several Latin American countries. During this 7 years of operation, we have been concerned about developing and strengthening networks of scientific collaboration in our region and disseminating the knowledge about depression and personality that we have achieved in our research. But also meetup networks are means for scientific knowledge from other latitudes and centers to reach all researchers and students in our region. This time, the topic is the phenotypic heterogeneity of depression, which is a subject to which precisely Meetup dedicates a specific international network. I thank our foreign and local professor for the generous collaboration. To Jaime Delgadillo, Helen Redeli, Michael Barkham, Birgit Watzke, Harry Banjard, and Paula Dagnino. Of course, I also thank Alex Ben, our research director, and our administration team, who, as always, have made this activity possible with the collaboration and committed work. I wish you all fruitful days of work and study. It is now my turn to introduce Dr. Alex Ben, who has been in charge of Meetup's research direction for the past several years. Dr. Ben has done spectacular work in this position, promoting several initiatives, one of which is precisely the creation of a collaborative network to study one of the most difficult problems in the scientific study of depression, which is its enormous variety and clinical heterogeneity. Dr. Ben is a clinical psychologist with a PhD in psychology at the University of Columbia and as an associate professor at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. He will present the lecture, The Importance of Mapping Out Heterogeneity in Depression to Improve Research and Treatment. Please, Dr. Ben, you have the words now.
Thank you, Juan Pablo, for your kind words of introduction. It is my pleasure to kick off our meeting, our third graduate student summer school, with what I hope will be a substantive introduction to our theme, which is heterogeneity of depression. I will try to explain why this is an extremely relevant topic for discussion and for research. And I will try to make the argument that really the future of research and treatment development in depression is really tied to the possibility of understanding phenotypic heterogeneity as well as endophenotypes or intermediate phenotypes or mechanisms that underlie this proliferation of different forms in which depression presents itself. I would like to thank again our team at Meetup, who have been working tirelessly to organize this summer school as they have for past venues and other activities that we do at Meetup. I would also like to thank Columbia Global Center, Santiago, for their continued support. And we really love our collaboration with Columbia Global Centers. And I hope this also will be broadcasted to the Columbia community. And of course, I want to thank ANIT, which is the Agency for the Research and Development in Chile, who have funded this particular Latin American network through the PCI, through their funds for international collaboration. And of course, my home in academic home in Santiago, which is the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, where I work as a professor. The title of my conference is The Importance of Mapping Out Heterogeneity in Depression to Improve Research and Treatment. I really think that the understanding, the parsing out of heterogeneity in depression is a crucial step of our advancement in research, basic research in depression, but more importantly, perhaps because this is what may benefit more people, actually treatment development and treatment specification. I will start with some local data, which is more familiar to us, but is quite worrisome as well. Chile is a country that has higher levels of depression than the average of countries to which we have agreed to compare ourselves. Particularly, we have 15.8% average nationally of symptoms of depression. This is not the whole diagnosis. This is only the screener diagnosis, which is basically anhedonia, diminished interest in pleasure and activities, and low mood, which does not compare favorably with Kessler's global estimates for high-income countries, which are quite similar also to low and middle-income countries. Chile is now considered to be a high-income country, and the average global average for depression positive screen, again, just the basic cardinal symptoms of anhedonia or diminished interest in pleasure and activities and low mood, is 10%. Which does not compare favorably to our own 15.8%. When we look at the whole diagnosis, not just the two screener symptoms that are used in some of the international research, but actually the whole diagnosis, we also find that we have a 6.2% of people in Chile that have the full diagnosis of depression. We also find that the proportion between men and women in Chile is 5-1, which is quite worrisome because generally speaking, globally, we do find that women have more risk to develop depression, but it's typically a 2-1 ratio. Chile, we have 5-1 ratio, and this affects mainly women that have lesser education and lower socioeconomic background. So it is really also a problem of education opportunities and poverty in Chile. And this also does not compare favorably with global estimates of the prevalence of depression. Now I'm speaking about the full diagnosis of depression. So we do have a problem in Chile with depression, which has really probably is quite related to the fact that we have MIDAP, that we have a government-funded institute with a focused scientific agenda for 10 years just to study depression and the relationships between depression and personality, because we do believe that you cannot really study depression in the void as something that has strong boundaries in relationship to other forms of psychopathology. And particularly, we are interested in understanding the links between depression and personality, and more focusedly between depression and personality dysfunction. So given this worrisome statistics, we have really worked quite hard at Meetup to develop a focused research agenda. And part of that, perhaps the most fun part, especially when we are studying something that is related with a lot of suffering. So we try to also have fun in doing this work. We have a history of fostering international collaboration and with the focus of building human capacity and training student and young scientists. And this is a little sample of the first Latin American workshop, which also coincided with the inauguration of Meetup some years ago, where we had really nice visitors, Peter Fonagy, Denise DeFay, Adam Horvat, and the Russos from Argentina. I know some of the students are with us today, and also many of our local researchers that have really driven the development of Meetup. Then we had another research summer school funded by Santander Universities and the University of Heidelberg some years ago in 2017, which was quite fun. Then we had a second Latin American workshop in Santiago with lovely visitors as well. We had John Clarking was here. We had Klaus Schmeck, Susanne Schröder-Müller from the University of Basel. We had really, really nice people that also visited and that are part of our friends now. Then we had a different meeting some years ago, another one in Heidelberg, and then we took the train from Heidelberg with all of our students and went to Basel, where we really had a lot of fun in an additional summer school for PhD students this time. We also developed some years ago with funding from ANID, a nice little gang called the Depression Heterogeneity Network. And we had our first meeting some years ago, which coincided with a spectacular solar eclipse. So this was really something fun. And this is Michael Barkham from the University of Sheffield. This is myself. This is Helen Verdelli from New York, from Columbia University, who also will join us, and Jaime Delgadillo, also from the University of Sheffield, who came down to Chile, and we work a lot in trying to understand depression heterogeneity, and also we had a lot of fun trying to look at the sun during those days. It was really, really spectacular. We had, I think it was like 90% in Santiago that we could see not quite 100% like you could see in the north, but it was still really, really interesting to be able to watch that together. Okay, so this is kind of our collaboration. This is a little bit of the work that we've been doing. Let's start now with our subject of study, which is depression. Depression has, of course, been the diagnosis of depression has a history, maybe a very long history. This is just a snapshot, just mapping out how depression made its way into the DSM and the ICD classifications, which are in a way the standard currency to classification and diagnosis and clinical work. What I would like to point out of this slide in particularly is that really the diagnosis of MDD has not changed in 40 years. This is amazing. If you think about where we were in terms of the world in 40 years ago, this is around the time I was born, and you think about the world now, everything has changed. Everything has changed. We have communication, we have cell phones, we have the internet, we have Instagram, I don't know, everything has changed. But the diagnosis of depression remains completely unaltered since the 1980s. Since DSM-3 and ICD-10. And this is quite strange because there's a lot of research and a lot of funding that has gone into studying depression. A lot of diagnoses have changed radically. Most currently now, probably the most radical changes in DSM-5 and ICD-11 is the new configuration of the diagnosis of personality disorder, which is something that interests me quite a bit, but I will not get into that today. But it's quite amazing that MDD has not changed a bit, except for like small things. It has not really fundamentally changed. And this probably is more of a problem than something that has benefited treatment development and the science in depression. With this constant, not flexible, but actually quite rigid notion and classification of depression, most research in depression has been conducted with this static, unaltered conceptualization of depression. And as you can see in these two slides, you can see that most of the funding, at least if you look at NIMH, which is by far the agency that invests more funds in research in mental health. This is the National Institute of Mental Health, which is a part of NIH, which is the National Institute of Health in the United States. And they have a $1 billion budget to study mental health, and depression by far leads spending. And always it's depression understood in this way in which it has remained unaltered since the 1980s. And this is, again, something that has driven research, and this has been of benefit, but I would like to focus on a little bit of the problems that are related with the fact that depression is viewed in this sort of homogeneous, stable way, rather than in all its complexity and heterogeneity. So if you look at the standard diagnosis of depression, we will be very traditional today. I know there are different ways to understand depression from a more psychoanalytic perspective, for example, but we will really stay with the more traditional approach to depression, which has made its way into the DSM, because it is really the standard and the most used conceptualization, not the only one, but certainly the most used, and the one that has really driven most of the research in basic psychopathology mechanisms, but also in treatment development. So this is what the community calls a polythetic diagnosis mechanism or system. What does polythetic mean? It means that you have a set of different symptoms, and you have a set of different rules. And those rules allow for a combination of symptoms in different ways that can help clinicians arrive at a diagnosis. So what does this polythetic system look like? For example, you have to have at least a number of the symptoms for a period of time. This is a rule. And it could be either this or this, but one of these two need to be in the picture. You have to have someone with either depressed mood or diminished interest, anhedonia, and then additional symptoms from this rest of the list. So you have symptoms and you have rules. And the combination of those symptoms with those rules allow for different combinations that still comply with those rules, okay? So the problem with that, with the polythetic rules as a classification system, is that just by different combinations, you can arrive at many, many different presentations. So the polythetic system, by definition, arrives at the vast heterogeneity of symptom presentation in such a way that you can have someone that has depressed mood, weight loss, insomnia, psychomotor agitation, and indecisiveness. And this would be, according to the rules, still classified as depression. And then you have someone without depressed mood, but with anhedonia, with weight gain, so the contrary, hypersomnia instead of insomnia, psychomotor retardation, and thoughts of death. And both of these presentations comply with the rules. Both things are depression by the rules. And yet, if you can imagine these two patients, they look quite differently. Yeah, one patient is lost weight, cannot sleep, and is agitated, if you can believe that. in depression, psychomotor agitation appears, and it's actually a risk marker for increased suicidality, for example. So we'll really have to look carefully at psychomotor agitation in the context of depression. And then you have someone with anhedonia and that has gained weight, that is sleeping all day, and that actually has psychomotor retardation, like a melancholic type, if you will. They do not look they do not look similar, and yet they have the same diagnosis. So this just gives us a sense of how the polythetic system that is in current use in DSM and ICD actually lead to quite vast heterogeneity. And the thing is, okay, we have agreed through the polythetic system that these two patients are depressed patients, but are the same mechanisms involved in these two phenotypes? Is the same treatment indicated for these two patients? We know that it is not the case. A psychiatrist, for example, would probably think about what would be the appropriate medicamentation for each one of these phenotypes, something more activating, for example, for this one here, something less activating for this one here. Perhaps this one is related to an affective disorder, and for example, like a mixed depression or bipolar. And this one perhaps not, is more of a melancholic type. So we know that it is not possible that these two patients are driven by the same disease mechanisms or require the same treatment. So the polythetic system actually tells us already that we need to think about depression in different ways. Some researchers say that really, if you think about it, depression is like fever. It could be the manifestation of different psychopathology processes. And you really need to understand what's going on under the surface. What are the mechanisms to really understand what the treatment is? Because not all fevers are related to the same problem, and they do not always require the same treatments. And really, if you think about fever in medicine, you will not decide on the treatment just by asking the patient, how does he or she experience like self-report of fever. You would try to get at objective measures as well. So this is one of the problems that we have with the polythetic system. Now, there are other sources of depression, of heterogeneity. So there's a structural source of heterogeneity that stems from the polythetic diagnosis system. Okay, this is without even looking at patient data, just by having rules and symptoms and combinations of symptoms that are resulting from those rules, you have theoretically at least about 300 different combinations of symptoms that are theoretical, just without looking at any patient data. This is just by the combination of rules, okay? But there are different sources of heterogeneity. So first of all, we have to agree about what do we mean by depression? Do we mean a dimensional gradient of symptoms where someone can be healthy, zero depression, then someone could have less than the cutoff threshold of symptoms, which is 5, and then the more symptoms you have, the more severe the depression is? Or do we think about it categorically? So from this line on, there's depression, and before this line, there's no depression. So do we think about it categorically? Do we think about this dimensionally? We know that, for example, if you're going back to personality disorder, absolutely right now we think about personality disorder in terms of dimensional models. This is absolutely the case of ICD-11 and absolutely, or 80% the case for the DSM alternative model for personality disorder. But with depression, you know, a lot of it is still considered categorically. Most patients that will enter clinical trials, for example, for treatment research in depression, will have to have some kind of threshold. They would have to have a categorical diagnosis, which we established, for example, with the gold standard, which is currently clinical interviews using the Hamilton or the SCID or something like that. So first of all, do we mean something that is dimensional, or we mean something that is categorical, or like a binary approach where you either have or you do not have the illness? There's a very important source of heterogeneity, which is artifact, which is artificial, which has not to do with how depression manifests itself in nature, so to speak, which has to do with how am I measuring depression? You would think that most measures that capture depression, the BDI, the PHQ-9, the quick inventory of depressive symptoms, the Hamilton, the MADRS, the Montgomery Asperger, I mean, you would think that they all coalesce into a kind of agreement, but actually there are over 280 scales that are used commonly to measure depression, and different scales do not register the same symptoms, right? So symptom scale 1 maps on all of the symptoms, but not on these ones. And then scale 2 actually does a pretty good job in mapping some of these that scale 1 does not, but then does not map the orange symptom or the green symptom, and so on. So really, there are over 280 scales for the measurement of depression. And of course, heterogeneity of depression will always be a function of the instrument that you're using. If you use the PHQ-9 that has 9 symptoms of depression that really map out on DSM, or if you use the BDI that it's much longer and asks for many, many more symptoms of depression, of course, with the BDI, you will have more heterogeneity because you are measuring more symptoms. So heterogeneity is always a function. We cannot really see how depression works. This is the idea of this. It's almost an epistemological problem. You cannot really research depression without measuring depression. It's like this idea, if a tree falls in a forest, but no one sees the tree falling in the forest, did the tree actually fall in that forest if no one ever saw it? So we have to measure depression, right? And depending on how we measure depression, we have different emergence of heterogeneity. There's a really interesting study by Eiko Fried where he said, okay, so let's take the most common measures of depression, the IDS, the BDI, the Hamilton, the quick inventory of depressive symptoms, the Montgomery Asperger depressive rating scale, and let's see what are the symptoms that all these measures look at. And combined, all these measures look at 52 symptoms. So if you take all these most common measures of depression, all of them look at 52 symptoms. And they are all here. Symptom 1, symptom 2, symptom 1, for example, is early insomnia. And we can see that most of them actually measure insomnia. Yeah, some of them measure insomnia specifically. Basically, you sleep too much or you sleep too little, and some of them have compound symptoms, basically sleep problems. Because if you actually divide sleep problems into 2 additional symptoms, I sleep too much, I sleep too little, then you get more heterogeneity because you are actually dividing one compound symptoms into different symptoms. But some of them look at it in a compound way, sleep problems, and some of them open it up into more specific forms. And then, for example, symptom 18, which is around here, I'm going to do it differently. But for example, symptom 11, which is grief, it's only measured by the IDS. None of the other measures actually look at grief as a symptom of depression. And you can see how we have a lot of overlap. Yes, true. But we have a lot of idiosyncrasy in depression measurement. So a lot of the measures are quite idiosyncratic. So you get a lot of depression heterogeneity just by artifact of how we actually decide to measure depression, right? Because if I use the IDS, perhaps I have a specific phenotype that is related to grief, but I will never capture that if I use the PHQ-9 or the BDI, which do not look at grief. And grief is kind of important because now grief is actually one of the symptoms that you can take into account, or you can still diagnose depression even in the context of grief, which is something that you could not do before. There was a rule against that, but DSM-5 removed that rule. You can actually diagnose depression even when there's grief. So we have heterogeneity due to instrumentation. The way we measure is very important. And this has nothing to do with depression in nature. This is just an artifact on how we measure it. We also have a very interesting kind of heterogeneity, which is actually related to different phenotypes or different symptom profiles. This has not only to do with depression heterogeneity stemming from dimensional versus categorical, or stemming from the just artifact of polythetic system. This is actually, when you look at patient data, not all patients will have checked all the same boxes. So if you take something like the PHQ-9, and we will have some very interesting presentations during this summer school, where we actually are trying to understand, using the PHQ-9, what are the different symptom profiles that emerge. So you have 9 symptoms if you think about the PHQ-9, which is the measure that we use the most at Meetup. Person 1 will have symptom 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, but not symptom 2, 5, 8, and 9. And then another person does not have symptom 5, or does not endorse symptom 7, 8, or 9. And the question is, are there some symptom profiles that are more frequent, that happen more frequently? Basically, there are over 10,000 times ways to meet DSM-5 MDD criteria. Okay, there's an extreme amount of heterogeneity that can be actually measured. And again, Eiko Fried has tried to do that with STAR-D data. STAR-D is one of the most important, it's probably the most ambitious RCT ever conducted, really. And it was conducted, perhaps some of you are familiar with the study, was basically conducted and designed to test and compare different sequences of antidepressive medication and also combination with psychotherapy to understand. So if your patient starts with citalopram and it does not respond to that, do you switch it to something else? Do you augment it? And then if he or she does not understand it, improve at that level, what do you do next, and what do you do next? So it's basically a RCT that is designed to understand clinical decision making in a kind of sequenced way, okay? And they look at the data of the STAR-D study over almost 4,000 patients, and they found, using the Hamilton rating scale, that there were over 1,000 different specific, unique symptom profiles that were endorsed by the patients in the study. And about 84% of these symptom profiles were actually endorsed by less than 6 subjects. So they were very specific, very personal, if you will, symptom presentations. And the most common, the most popular symptom configuration, something like that, for example, taking, if this one was the most common, like symptom 1, 2, 3, 4, not 5, yes, 6, not 7, 8, or 9, the most common one was only endorsed by about 2% of the sample. Okay, so if you look at patient data using very traditional measures that map out on DSM criteria, of course, it appears that depression is very personal, that every depression is different. Now, again, do we offer the same treatment to everyone? So does it matter that actually depression is so personal in a way? Do we believe that even though you have this heterogeneity, we still think that it's the same treatment for everyone? The STAR-D actually is the most elegant, sophisticated, ambitious RCT. But you could not say that one of the learnings of STAR-D is that we are really good at treating people with depression. It's quite the contrary. One of STAR-D was quite sobering, okay, to the extent that we are not as good in treating depression as we think we are. And maybe one of the reasons we're not as good is because we're thinking about depression in this kind of homogeneous way. We're not taking into account heterogeneity. We are saying, okay, we have the average depressed patient that will respond to the average depression treatment. And in this average, we lose the heterogeneity, and we also lose clinical effectiveness. So perhaps what we should be doing is understanding what are the most common symptom profiles, and maybe thinking about what could be differential treatment alternatives for different symptom profiles. Another problem, which is not really possible in the because the polythetic symptom system actually, with the exception of anhedonia and low mood, it doesn't really matter what symptoms you have, as long as you have the rules to have your either anhedonia or low mood, and then 4 more symptoms. Yeah, you have to have 5. So, but does it matter? Are all symptoms created equal? Are some symptoms more characteristic of depression, or it doesn't matter any combination you have? This is important because if some symptoms are more crucial, more central, stronger, then those symptoms should probably be the target of treatment interventions, right? And network analysis, and we will be hearing a little bit about this in our talks and our student presentations, is a very interesting way to see above and beyond polythetic symptom configurations, which are actually the symptoms that have more centrality, that are more important, and probably that should actually emerge as prioritized treatment targets. Okay, so we can look at something like this and say, okay, so energy loss, sadness seem to be quite central, and then we have sympathetic arousal that is very central, but why is it a little white ball instead of a gray ball? Because it's not a DSM symptom. So if you look at symptom configurations here, you can see that a very important, this is basically, for those of you who are not familiar with network analysis, think about an airport map, for example, of the United States, and you have a lot of planes flying to small, not important places in the US, and then you have Atlanta, for example, or JFK, or Miami, where you have this big international airports that are really connected with all other airports in the US and are very important. And probably if an enemy will take out JFK, it would really disturb the connectivity with the other smaller airports, so that those other smaller airports probably could not function. They will not get planes. They would just cease to be relevant. So paralleling that to depression, if you have symptoms that have a lot of centrality and connection, this is connection, strong connections between symptoms. This is very, very strong connection here between these two symptoms. And then centrality that are really central to the network, you actually see that from the most central symptoms here, a lot of them are actually not even related, are not even present in DSM. Panic has a lot of centrality in a network for depressed patients. And we have tried to really disengage anxiety from depression. For example, the BDI exists, and then the BAI exists, the back anxiety inventory, and they are built they are designed to have low convergence validity. So you do not want the BIA and the BDI to actually correlate. But again, and the BAI actually is a measure of panic, really. And the BDI is a measure of depression. But how is it possible? Because in this network, you can see that panic and phobia has actually a lot of centrality. So not all symptoms are created equal, and not all the symptoms that we believe are important as per DSM actually are the ones that you really need to be focusing on if you look at this nice networks of symptoms of depression. Okay, thank you. Another important source of heterogeneity is onset course. Is it the same if a depression starts at 13 years old? Or if it starts in the more sort of average, which is early adulthood, 23, 24, is it the same depression? Well, actually, we do know that the earlier the onset, the more complex the depression is, the more resistant to treatment it will be, the more likely it will be co-occurrent with, for example, personality dysfunction. So of course, it's not the same, a depression that starts at 14 years old, if you compare it to a depression that starts, in early adulthood. Does it matter if it starts, peripartum? If the first episode of depression is actually around birth of a child, before or after? Does it matter if depression is recurrent? We know that depression is quite recurrent. It's not as episodic. There's a lot of recurrence and of maintenance of interepisodic residual symptoms. People do not have an episode and then get better and then do not have any episodes again. Depression it's a very recurrent illness. Even for patients that show remission of symptoms, there's a 30% chance that they will actually have a recurrence of depression. This is much higher, for example, than recurrence for personality disorder. Patients that have borderline personality disorder and that show remission of symptoms, for example, through treatment or just because of the passage of time, actually have a lower rate of recurrence than patients with depression. And we're talking about personality disorder. It's your personality, something that should stay with you all the time. But actually, patients that have borderline that show remission have a lower recurrence rate than patients that have depression and show remission. They still have a 30% chance of recurrence. If they have a second episode, they have a 60% chance of recurrence. If they have a third episode, they have a 90% chance of recurrence. So it's 30, 30, 30. It's a 30% rule. Okay. Obvious sources of heterogeneity are related also with social determinants, with sociodemographic attributes of patients and on culture, environment. This is the whole field of social determinants of mental health, and in particular, social determinants of depression, which of course add several layers of heterogeneity to the problem. I'm going to go a little bit. There's genetic liability as well. Perhaps Juan Pablo may talk a little bit about this because he has really led a group at VIDAP that are studying epigenetic mechanisms as related to early adverse experiences, for example. If you have low genetic liability, your depression could also be driven by early adversity. I will talk a little bit about that in a second, or losses or financial stressors. And if you have high genetic liability, it doesn't really matter if you experience any of these things. You will probably have a chronic course of depression, and it will have a direct pathway into depression without actually having to go through early adversity, depending on how strong your genetic liability is. But we know as clinicians that it's also useful to ask patients if there are other people in the family that have had depression. This is particularly important for bipolar depression. Is it possible that just because we are not looking at heterogeneity, we have not been quite able to find biological markers that are related with treatment improvement, for example? Because it's possible that different types of depression, different symptom profiles do not relate to the same biological markers. So it has been extremely difficult to find biological markers for depression, but that may also be secondary to the fact that there is no one depression. So you have to look at biological markers of symptom profiles, right? Not at categorical diagnosis of depression. Does have it, doesn't have it. Let's put all of them together and let's look at, genome-wide associations or biological markers. It doesn't work like that. You cannot find those genome-wide associations with depression, but you can find them with symptom profiles or even specific symptoms. Okay, so you have to open it up to heterogeneity to actually advance the field of biological markers as well as genome-wide associations. This is a really nice additional way to look at heterogeneity, which is not even look at PHQ-9 or Hamilton or any clinical interviews of measures, but actually to ask patients, what are the outcomes that are important for you? Okay, and this was a really nice study that was published in the Lancet by Astrid Shevnans, who actually asked patients and informal caregivers and formal caregivers of people with depression. So what are the symptoms that are important for you? If you want to get better of your depression, what do you want to change? So not even looking at PHQ-9s or anything of that, just looking at, and these are not DSM symptoms. These are, social functioning, perception of self. So these are also important problems of depression that are important for our patients. So self-exclusion, family life. I cannot participate in my family life. My interpersonal relationships. There is no single item of interpersonal relationships in the PHQ-9. And yet for patients, it's extremely painful to be depressed and have social exclusion, isolation. These are very important aspects also of, in addition to the symptoms of restlessness, irritability, frustration, self-control, mood reactivity, other things that may be represented in DSM, but this is a really nice perspective of asking patients about the important symptoms, not only looking at our measures. Also, if you look at outcome of depressive symptoms, you see that a lot of the things that predict successful outcome in, for example, very commonly used SSRI are actually not symptoms that are in DSM. For example, race, years of education, being white, actually predicts outcome. And this is not something that we conceptualize as part of depression, right? So heterogeneity also had to do with attributes of people or social components or that are actually related to outcomes. So we should not only look at symptom configuration as per our measurement systems or classification systems, but also at complexity. So complexity actually means that in addition to symptoms or severity, the presence and the number of symptoms, you have things that are exogenous, that are not related to the depressive diagnosis, but are very much related to, for example, treatment outcome. I want to just maybe stop by talking about when numbers get serious, okay? The argument here is that by looking at depression as a single thing, by just lumping together all these different symptom profiles or these exogenous variables that are related to depression, course of depression, instrument variability, and so on, we probably have really staggered the advancement of more effective treatments. You know, we are not very good at treating depression. We should be much better. And probably we could be much better at treating depression if we actually open depression up to heterogeneity and we develop more sensitive interventions, pharmacological, psychotherapy, psychosocial, that can be scaled up, but that take into account heterogeneity rather than saying, okay, patient has depression, CBT, IPT, citalopram, combination, combo, psychotherapy, CBT with SSRI, because it does not appear to work like this. You know, mechanism research, treatment research has all probably been delayed because of the fact that we're not taking into account heterogeneity. We could be much better if we would have parsed out heterogeneity years ago, instead of still operating for over 40 years with one static kind of lump combination of symptoms, and it's the same, it's always depression, but it's actually not always the same. I would like to stop with the, I'm not going to go into detail, but just pointing out that another very important source of heterogeneity is early life maltreatment. So this is an echo phenotype. So is it the same depression for someone that has experienced early life maltreatment than someone who has not? You know, this may also be related with genetic liability. So maybe someone that has depression as a result or related to early life maltreatment, it's not the same pathway than just a genetic liability that has a direct influence on the manifestation of depression without having to go through early life maltreatment. And we've done a lot of work looking into this problem of early life maltreatment, because we have found that actually the more experiences of early life maltreatment you have, the more probability you have to be a non-responder in treatment, to have a more complex, more severe case of depression. So early life maltreatment really drives complexity, comorbidity, more psychosocial factors, and severity in depression. So one of the first things we should ask our depressed patients is, have you experienced early life maltreatment? And if the patients say yes, we probably know that we have a different kind of depression than if the patient says no. And we can maybe anticipate that that patient will be more complex, more resistant to treatment, maybe more personality dysfunction as well. We know that half of the patients that have personality dysfunction also report early life maltreatment, particularly emotional and physical neglect and sexual abuse. Okay, I will stop here. Actually, I have a few additional slides, but actually they repeat on the same. So I will stop here, and maybe we can open it up for questions at this point. So thank you very much for your attention. And I will
good. That feels good. Baby.
Just wanna be alone with you. Just wanna be alone with you. Just wanna be alone with you. The same old thing that keeps me around. And if you wanna come around, baby, it's cool. And if you wanna fuck around, baby, I do. Just wanna be alone with you. With you. With you. With you. Just wanna be alone. What was your name again? I've seen so many of them come. Want me just play pretend? All your girls, they just wanna have fun. But it's the same old thing that we all see. Same old thing that keeps me keen. But I just wanna be alone with you. Just wanna be alone with you. Same old thing, the same old thing that keeps me around. If you wanna come around, baby, it's cool. And if you wanna fuck around, baby, I do. Just wanna be alone with you. With you. With you. With you. Just wanna be alone. here we go now. Fat man scoop on the mic, mix in the mix on the wheels of steel. This is what I was fucking born to do. Let's go.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all at the second lecture of our summer school here at Meetup about depression heterogeneity. And it's my really great pleasure to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Paula Dagnino, who is a remarkable scientist and has done a very significant work internationally and has really driven some of the areas of our research at Meetup. She's currently an associate researcher at Meetup. She's a psychologist. She also has a clinical private practice where she sees patients. And she has a PhD in psychotherapy from the Universidad Católica and Universidad de Chile, and also from Heidelberg University. She's currently an associate professor at Universidad San Sebastián and an associate researcher at Meetup. And she will be delivering a conference entitled Psychotherapy as a Personalized Science, Considering the Individual Patient. So it is my, please, Paula, feel welcome here. It's lovely to have you here. Paula is also a researcher in this international research network. So thank you very much for being here today.
Well, thank you very much, Alex, for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to present not only my results, but also my reflection about this important subject. As you told us the title is Psychotherapy as a Personalized Science, Considering the Individual Patient. Our roadmap will be first, and I think I'm gonna repeat some of the things you already told us about depression and heterogeneity, and I will stop a little bit to understand the complex cases. Then we'll go to this personalized mental health treatment and to a more descriptive treatment, transdiagnostic. So I think we all know that depression is a leading cause of disability, is associated with a 40% higher lifetime risk, worse outcomes for comorbid medical conditions. In Chile, we have almost 22% of the people that have had a psychiatric disorder in the last 12 months. Anxiety and depression are the most prevalent. And in the case of depressive disorders, 9% of the people have suffered from it during their lifetime and 5% within a year. On the other hand, we have a lot of other comorbid and diseases like alcohol and drug use that they're also high in our population, and almost 11% and 8%. But just to give a glimpse about history on this subject, we know that for as long as scholars have been studying depression and writing about it, they have always recognized that it comes in different forms and may have distinct causes. First of all, Hippocrates, I don't know how to say it in English, Hippocrates identified a melancholic temperament by an excess of black bile. Then we have Burton's with the anatomy of melancholy. Carl Baum, which he differentiates between dysthymia from cyclothymia, and Kraepelin that differentiates depression from manic depressive psychosis and dementia precoce. One of the first, I just put DSM-5 and ECD-10, but I will like to talk about descriptive diagnosis. And this was one of the first modern attempts to standardize depression nosology, the DSM-2, and subsequently the recognition of episodic depressions, and at the same time, motivated by a diverse diagnostic categories, looking for better interrelability. We have DSM-3, DSM-4, which defines broad categories of depression, including the modern definition of MDD. But what about depression? What is depression? And first of all, we can look at heterogeneity, not only in history, but also in studies. Here we have a well-known study of Fried and Nies that reanalyzed data from the study, if you don't know it, the sequence treatment alternatives to relieve depression, and they identify 1,000 unique symptom profiles. And here you can see the profiles. Of these, 83% were endorsed by 5 or fewer subjects, and 48% were endorsed by only 1 individual. And the most common symptom profile exhibited a frequency of only 1%. So there's a great diversity in symptoms. Alex already talked about the high top. This is the way Brown and especially Kotov have developed this spectra of the taxonomy of psychopathology. It was an effort to construct syndromes and their components based on the observed covariation of symptoms, grouping them, the related symptoms, and therefore trying to reduce this heterogeneity. And also it combines co-occurring syndromes into these spectra, mapping out comorbidity. But also we can see heterogeneity in the biological area, neuroimaging and genetics. I just put some a photo. I will try to eliminate WhatsApp. This is paper of Butch and Liston from this year. And you can see that in letter A, it was evident that there were 4 subtypes of depression. They had distinct patterns of atypical functional connectivity, but also these 4 subtypes of depression were associated with distinct clinical symptom profiles in the Hamilton. And on C, you can see that also these subtypes were different in the depression severity. So there are differences, there are different subtypes of depressive patients. And finally, this was an interesting paper of Rantala from the developmental psychiatry. He performed an exhaustive analysis of subtypes of depression, but looking at the causes of them, and he found 12 subtypes based on proximate mechanism. For example, postpartum depression, season depression, romantic rejection, grief, etc. So what we have seen so far, there's the heterogeneity, there are subtypes of depression, dimensions commonly considered for this identification are severity, the course of the disorder, onset, symptom-based, developmental psychiatry, as Rantala looked at. And to make this issue more complex, there is one subtype of depression, the complex case. I just put the complex case. This is a concept that has gained strength in research. It has to do mainly with the long-standing debate of personality pathology and depression and how do they relate to each other. But complexity is not only related to personality. There are other variables that practical clinicians, which refer as complex patients, that imply going beyond symptoms. Monica Safford in 2007 proposed this intersection within social, personal, and clinical circumstances on depression because it had a better clinical utility. She identified determinants of health, such as socioeconomics, culture, biology, environment, and behavior, looking at weighted vectors. These vectors are interrelated, much like a network. So a factor influencing one of them will have an impact on the rest of the vectors and ultimately on the outcome. As this is very small, but as Monica Safford, Wong in 2008 identified a preliminary list of common features for complex cases. And again, there is the dimensions like symptoms, of course, but safety features, physical features, intellectual, personality, psychosocial, motivational, and treatment history failures. Delgadillo, on the other hand, which we're going to hear from him as a keynote really tomorrow, I think. Delgadillo also made a study comparing complex versus non-complex depression, and what he found was that differences were in anxiety, in work, in social adjustment, personality disorder, and demographic data. And Baek also made an analysis of the main elements to predict depression risk. And he found stress in everyday life, physical activities, and physical diseases. So there is heterogeneity in depression, we know about that. There are complex cases that include more than symptoms, more than personality, other variables. And I made a study trying to identify, I conceptualized profiles of depression, trying to see this, if I found these subtypes, but considering dimensions like symptomatic, early experiences, psychological dimensions, and social networks. So I had two aims. The first one was to define data-driven depression profiles. And also I wanted to explore if these profiles had differences in the therapeutic processes. So I applied several instruments to patients that were consulting to psychotherapy with different diagnoses. 251 patients from 5 outpatient clinics. And I had all this data for each of the patients as baseline. So I first did a multiple imputation analysis. I don't know, do you see my mouse? Oh, no? Yeah, okay. Yeah. So I first did a multiple imputation analysis, and then I trained several supervised models in order to predict, to see if the variables that I choose, all of these, predicted or not depression, considering the BDI, the score, Chilean score, and several machine learning, I were trained, but classification tree was the model with most accuracy. Using the leave one out CB technique, that is training the model with n-1 data and testing with the remaining data n times, a lot of times. So this was my first step. I confirmed that these variables allowed me to differentiate between patients with depression and without depression, or functional maybe symptoms. And I wanted to go to see if there were profiles. And for these to generate profiles, I grouped them, creating using the PAM algorithms, and the classification power was measured by discriminant analysis. As you can see, I found 3 groups that were identified. I'm gonna talk about them. But that was a result that was surprising. I expected to have, like Delgadillo, a complex and non-complex profile, but I found 3 profiles. And these were the 3 profiles with the variables that I look at. I conceptualized them as a profile of low complexity, a medium complexity, and high complexity, because I think that with all these variables, complexity is present. If you can see, the red squares means that there is a high presence of that variable. Medium presence is dark blue, and low presence is light blue. So what I found is that for patients that showed low complexity, the age they were older, of course they didn't, or they had less physical illness, less previous psychological problems, less symptoms, they had less adverse experiences, insecure attachment, but they have medium avoidant attachment, as also functioning vulnerabilities. They had good adaptive traits of personality. And of course, what we can expect in the social areas that they have a high quantity of social network and also satisfaction with those networks. On the other hand, we have the high complexity profile, and you can see that as combining with the medium complexity, both had high physical illness, high previous psychological problems, and the high complexity had, of course, more symptoms. They have, we were talking about adverse early experiences. There is a difference because medium complexity was the one that had physical neglect more than even the complexity profile. Insecure attachment, higher dependency and self-criticism, and they have less networks, social networks, and less satisfaction with them. This is just a glimpse, complex, about the variables and the three profiles that I found. But then I asked myself, okay, the clinical utility is not only to find profiles, but also to see if these profiles behave different during the process, considering two variables. One is the session evaluation questionnaire that I defined as session quality, and the other one is the stress with OQ. Both are self-report instruments that the patient answered in a session-to-session basis. For the analysis, I only took 4 time points of the process, sessions 1, 4, 7, and 10. And for this, I had 129 patients. What I did, I did an analysis, a latent growth analysis with these 4 time points. You can see that the graphs in the upper part of the slide are only descriptive. I put there only the mean of, in the left-hand graph, the OQ, and on the right hand, the SEQ. And in the lower part of the slide, there are the models. Both models were significant. It explained these processes. And if you can see on the OQ model, what we found is that low complexity patients, blue, just to give the blue, people do not differ in any of the 4 times. Patients with medium complexity, the orange line, has negative slope. Therefore, for 3 sessions, distress decreases 4 points. In high complexity, for every 3 sessions, distress decreases 7 points. And if you look at the quality of the session, the self-report quality of the session, we can see that low complexity, again, blue, there is an improvement in the quality of the session between session 1 and 4, but then this perception declines, stabilizes. Patients with medium complexity, the orange line, have a continuous improvement, slower than the low complex patients, and patients with high complexity starts at the lower average and has a constant growth. Just a glance of what can be concluded is that patients with higher complexity, they decrease constantly in distress, meanwhile gaining more perception of the quality of the session. Clinically, I can say that maybe these patients need more therapy. Now, getting about therapy and about psychotherapy, we know that psychotherapy is a treatment that has sufficient evidence for depression. Recent meta-analysis of Kuipers showed that the effects of psychological treatments in primary care are comparable to pharmacotherapy, and that combined treatment is better than either psychotherapy or pharmacotherapy alone. But we also know that the majority of patients do not achieve full remission after an initial treatment, and a substantial portion are treatment resistant. Untreated depression is in turn have substantial personal and societal costs. The studies have found that 50% of patients respond to treatment, but 20% discontinue their treatment. Some treatments are ineffective, and in the study program, only 1/4 of the patients achieve remission. One of the main explanations for these disappointing findings is heterogeneity. So studies must take into account certain subgroups of patients with distinct pretreatment characteristics because they have showed an ability to benefit more. We get, therefore, to personalized mental health treatment. The mandate to consider the individual patient was first formulated in 1967 by a founding father of modern clinical psychology, Gordon Paul. This is a text from its article. It says, in all its complexity, the question towards which all outcome research should ultimately be directed is the following: what treatment by whom is most effective for this individual with that specific problem and under which set of circumstances? So the spirit of this passage is the question, what works for whom? What is personalization? Personalization aims to determine which characteristics of an individual patient predict the outcome of a particular treatment to achieve a better match between the individual and the treatment received. This approach is based on the assumption that patients respond differently to treatments, and it's not limited to somatic medicine, but can also be applied to the treatment of mental disorders using psychotherapy. Others have conceptualized it like precision diagnosis, person-specific, idiographic, but in the same way I will talk about now of personalized mental health treatment. Prominent examples of personalization, it's the PI, Personalized Advantage Index, which provides for each individual the treatment among the available ones that it's most likely to lead to a positive outcome for them. This is a result of one of the studies.
Ayúdame.
Sorry.
Ayúdame.
This is, wait, just a minute. So with the PI, there is a study that compares a randomized study, taking into account patients that were selected for this optimal, they tell optimal treatment using the PI, and the non-optimal. And as you can see, the optimal, the patients that were directed to the optimal treatment were at the end having less symptomatology. Another one is the TRI treatment navigator of LUTS, of the laboratory of LUTS, really. This is a digital navigation system designed to support psychological interventions on a day-to-day basis. It supports clinical decision-making at the beginning of therapy by giving empirically based recommendations about the optimal treatment strategy. This is through, of course, algorithms, and two are the strategies proposed. One is the personalized treatment recommendations, and the other one is the personalized treatment adaptation. What is interesting is that therapists access to this kind of software where they can find baseline variables of patients, the dropout rate, risk, really, and what is the best model to treat the patient. And there's also session-to-session guidance also, where they can access to some recommendations, taking into account the answers of patients. I was surprised about this technology. And Jaime Delgadillo, Jamie, as I told, did some studies with a data-driven method of identifying, I already say about it, but complex cases, and comparing the high-intensity therapy versus low intensity. And what he found was that complex patients benefit more of high-intensity therapy. And he also has this online software for the therapist with less information, of course, than Lutz, but where the therapists see what some variables of the patient, and the software tells them if they need a high-intensive treatment or a low-intensive treatment. These are only some, I think, the most studied examples of personalization, but what I see is that many of them, not all of them, are in this treatment selection, comparing between randomizing and comparing between models of therapies such as CBT, TP, and mostly relying on symptomatic variables as baseline characteristics, and all of them considering a sign of good results only final outcomes, such as symptom reduction or dropout. Summarizing what we have seen so far, we have revised heterogeneity, complex patients. We have found profiles of this complexity, and we can look at different processes for these profiles. So personalizing mental health treatment is really an imperative. It doesn't mean only to select the personalization, which treatment is better for a particular patient. It has to include guiding, training therapists in different approaches or specific techniques necessary to look at this personalization. Therefore, transdiagnostic and modular treatments approaches must be developed. This is a potential paradigm shift where modularity refers to complex activities that are included in simpler parts that may function independently. And this approach has the potential to benefit targeting common underlying dimensions of and enhancing personalization by promoting greater flexibility. Accumulating research is demonstrating the utility of these models and protocols. And just to give you some example, there is the Unified Protocol for Transdiagnostic Treatment of Emotional Disorders of Barlow. It is a protocol based on emotion-focused cognitive behavioral interventions in 5 stages: mindful, cognitive, flexibility, identifying and preventing patterns, increasing awareness, and interoceptive and situational emotional focus exposure. Another one is the Unified Protocol for the Psychodynamic Treatment of Depressive Disorder of Leisenring and Schauenburg, in which they include supportive interventions and expressive interventions. And something new also is to have training in the terminating process. Again, these protocols are mainly theoretical. There is a need, therefore, to focus on common factors, especially in our reality of low, medium income countries, where therapists don't have a specific theoretical training, and they work mainly by clinical intuition, especially in these high demanding settings. We have the input of self-report instruments applied to patients, but what about patients and therapists' experiences? And I think this is a very important source of information to the transdiagnostic personalization, to have information for a better modular treatment, listening to their experiences, observations, and concerns may help the researchers. We have Katis Fischer and Alex and Paula Rasuris that they have asked therapists what is complex patient, and they found perceptions that go beyond symptoms, intrinsic characteristics like negative attitude of patients, negative effects on therapists, and a difficult treatment context. Alex told us about Astrid Tevenes, that also made an international online survey with open-ended questions for patients, informal caregivers, and healthcare professionals, and they identified a list of 80 outcome domains, which we must include. These are the domains that patients, for example, say they get better in, not only symptoms. And a new, digamos, it's not new, but a project that is being developed right now in Chile has to do with the doctoral thesis of Karina Zúñiga, and a project led by Guillermo de la Parra, and they are looking for psychotherapeutic competences for treating complex depression in primary care. And they have used interviews to users, patients, to experience psychologists and the psychotherapists that treat patients in this context. So through this information, they made a protocol of training in these competences necessary for treating complex depression in primary health. There are 12 classes, 12, I don't know, modules. It's not modules, it's sequential. And they are trying to, well, finish it in process. And I think this will be a very interesting input for this context. To end my presentation, I wanted to make some conclusions and challenges. Until now, we have been mainly confined to the DSM or CM, some symptomatic disorders, and we must go further to understand the multiple dimensions of patients and of therapists. And given our reality, we must carry out naturalistic studies that although they have limitations, they will be closer to the clinical ones and therefore to their implementation. The advanced and complex statistical analysis have improved this area of research. We can't deny it, and we must be able to use them. But a challenge is that they need some expertise. This type of analysis is often provided by mathematicians and statisticians, but those of us, including me, who are clinicians and do research, find it difficult to dialogue in this field with professions that come from the field of numbers. On the other hand, we know that in Latin America, clinicians do not usually read research because it is very complex. This produces a gap that we must find a way to deal with and improve in the new generations of therapies. And even though statistical analyses are fundamental, we should not become only an algorithm. We should include and give its importance to clinical practice. As Cohen says, reminds us, clinicians have long recognized the importance of tailoring assessment and intervention delivery to the needs and characteristics of the individual patient. What I recommend to achieve personalized mental health treatment, I think we need to have different inputs. On the one hand, self-reports of patients, but not only baseline characteristics, also process studies, alliance, small o, dropout, psychopharmacology, for example, and also follow-up, and to take information of the relevant stakeholders, the patients themselves, the health workers. They can give us a very good information of what is necessary to train. Where do I go now? I think I don't know how to say it, but what I'm dreaming about with my research is to identify those key variables that can differentiate between profiles, because I'm not going to apply 10 instruments to patients to see to look at their profiles. Therefore, to develop upon that a short instrument that can be applied at baseline and go and apply it to a bigger sample, specifically in primary health, with process variables and also follow-up. And with these results, analyze again the data to maybe confirm or find another profiles and how the processes are for each one of them. Include the input from patients and therapists. And therefore, with all of this information, develop a modular treatment guidelines and then compare the training, the psychotherapists with therapists trained on this modular treatment or not. I think 20 years, I have 20 years of research or more. That's it. Thank you.
Be alone with you. Just wanna be alone with you. The same old thing that keeps me around. If you wanna come around, baby, it's cool. And if you wanna fuck around, baby, I do. Just wanna be alone with you. With you. With you, with you, just wanna be alone. your name again? I've seen so many of them come. Want me just play pretend? All your girls, they just wanna have fun. But it's the same old thing that we all see. Same old thing that keeps me keen. But I just wanna be alone with you. Just wanna be alone with you. The same old thing that keeps me around. If you wanna come around, baby, it's cool. And if you wanna fuck around, baby, I do just wanna be alone with you.